gunshot exploded through the forest so loudly that birds burst from the trees in every direction. Mary screamed as the bullet tore through her shoulder. She collapsed into wet mud, her flashlight flying from her hand and spinning wildly across the ground before stopping near a rusted metal cage. Rain hammered the forest relentlessly. The dogs began barking, not ordinary barking. These were desperate sounds, terrified sounds, the kind of cries that came from creatures who had suffered too long. Mary struggled to breathe as pain burned through her body like fire. Her fingers pressed against her shoulder, instantly covered in blood. Then she looked up, and what she saw nearly stopped her heart. Cages, rows and rows of cages hidden beneath dark camouflage nets deep inside the woods. Some cages were stacked on top of each other. Some were barely large enough for the animals inside to move. Inside them were dogs, thin dogs, weak dogs, scarred dogs. Dogs with shaved patches of fur and strange markings painted onto their skin. One small beagle trembled violently in the corner of its cage. A German shepherd stared silently with exhausted eyes. Another dog limped in circles endlessly as if its mind had already broken. Mary's breathing shook. "Oh my God!" Gunshot cracked through the rain. The bullet struck a tree beside her head. "Get away from the cages!" A man shouted somewhere in the darkness. Mary tried to stand but collapsed again. Beside her, a black shepherd mix with amber eyes growled viciously toward the trees. Shadow, the stray dog she had been feeding for months. The same dog who had led her here tonight. The same dog who had escaped from this nightmare. Flashlights moved between the trees now. Men were coming. Shadow grabbed Mary's sleeve gently with his teeth, trying to pull her toward the cages, toward the trapped dogs. Mary's vision blurred from pain. But one terrifying realization became painfully clear. Shadow hadn't brought her here by accident. He had brought her here for help. And if she failed tonight, those dogs would disappear forever. 3 months earlier, everyone in town knew Mary Carter. Most people simply called her the widow on Elm Street. Every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, Mary walked through town carrying 2 large bags filled with dog food, chicken scraps, blankets, and bowls of water. The stray dogs waited for her faithfully, near the old gas station, behind abandoned grocery stores, under bridges, beside overflowing dumpsters. Some limped toward her carefully, some barked excitedly, others approached slowly, still afraid of humans. Mary knew every single one: Tiny, Bruno, Patch, Old Rex, Luna. She even gave names to dogs that never allowed her close. Feeding them had become part of her life after her husband Daniel died from cancer 2 years earlier. After Daniel's death, silence consumed her house. Silence at breakfast, silence at night, silence in every room. Some mornings Mary sat staring at Daniel's empty chair for nearly an hour without realizing it. The dogs gave her purpose, they needed her, and somehow that helped her survive. But one dog was different from all the others: Shadow. He appeared suddenly one rainy evening without warning, large black fur, amber eyes, a scar stretching across his side. Unlike the other strays, Shadow never fought for food, never barked unnecessarily, never allowed strangers close. He watched everything carefully, like he was always expecting danger. The first time Mary tried touching him, Shadow backed away immediately. But after several weeks, he slowly began trusting her. One cold evening, Mary noticed fresh cuts across his legs. "Where have you been?" she whispered while placing food before him. Shadow simply stared at her silently, almost like he understood every word. Then Mary noticed something hanging beneath his collar, a metal tag, rusty and scratched. She removed it carefully. Stamped onto the metal were strange letters, K9X, and beneath it, "Property of Harbor Research Facility." Mary frowned. She had never heard of Harbor Research Facility before, but Shadow's reaction terrified her. The moment he saw the tag in her hand, he began trembling. The next morning, Mary visited the local diner carrying the metal tag inside her coat pocket. Rain tapped softly against the windows while old country music played quietly overhead. "Mary Carter," a familiar voice called. "You look troubled." Mary looked up to see Walter Grayson approaching her table with coffee in his hand. Walter had once been the town sheriff before retiring several years earlier. People respected him because he never ignored ugly truths. Mary handed him the tag. "Do you know what this is?" Walter's expression changed instantly. "Where did you get this?" "From one of the stray dogs." Walter looked around carefully before lowering his voice. "You need to stay away from this." Mary frowned. "What does that mean?" Walter stared at the tag for several seconds. "Years ago," he said quietly, "there were rumors about a private research operation outside town." "What kind of research?" Walter hesitated. "Animal experiments." Mary blinked. "You mean medical testing?" "Not exactly." Something about Walter's tone unsettled her immediately. He leaned closer. "Dogs started disappearing years ago, strays mostly, but sometimes pets too." Mary felt cold suddenly. "No one could prove anything," Walter continued. "But people talked." "What kind of things?" Walter sighed heavily. "Military contracts, behavioral conditioning, aggression enhancement, tracking intelligence." Mary stared at him in disbelief. "That sounds insane." "Maybe," Walter replied quietly. "But that tag belongs to them." That exact moment, Shadow appeared outside the diner window, standing silently in the rain, watching Mary. Walter noticed him immediately. "That dog didn't choose you randomly," he muttered. Mary looked at Shadow carefully. For the first time she realized the dog wasn't just surviving. He was hiding. Over the following weeks, Shadow's behavior became stranger. Sometimes he vanished for entire days. Then suddenly he would return covered in mud, exhausted and injured. Mary began noticing patterns. Shadow always disappeared toward the northern woods beyond town, and every time he returned he looked more frightened. One evening Mary followed him. She stayed far enough behind to avoid alarming him while moving quietly through the trees. The deeper she walked, the colder the forest became. Branches cracked beneath her boots, wind whispered through the darkness. Then she noticed tire tracks, fresh ones, large trucks. Mary crouched beside them nervously. Who would drive this deep into the woods at night? Then she heard it, dogs barking, dozens of them. The sound echoed faintly through the trees. Shadow stopped ahead of her and looked back, waiting, almost like he wanted her to continue. Mary's heart pounded violently now. She pushed through thick bushes carefully and froze. Ahead stood a tall chain-link fence wrapped in black tarp. Beyond it sat several warehouse buildings surrounded by floodlights. Men carrying rifles walked between them. A truck rolled slowly through the gates, and inside the truck cages, dogs trapped inside cages. One golden retriever scratched desperately against the metal bars while another dog cried weakly in the darkness. Mary covered her mouth in horror. "My God." Suddenly Shadow growled sharply. Headlights swung toward the woods. Someone had seen movement. A voice shouted. Flashlights burst through the darkness. Mary ran. Branches whipped across her face while shouting erupted behind her. Shadow sprinted beside her, guiding her through the forest at terrifying speed. Mary could hear footsteps behind them, closer, closer. Then suddenly Shadow barked loudly toward another direction. The men followed the sound immediately. The dog had distracted them. Mary stumbled onto the roadside, gasping for breath nearly 20 minutes later. But Shadow didn't return, not that night, not the next morning either. And for the first time since Daniel died, Mary felt truly afraid. 3 days passed before Shadow returned. Mary found him lying behind the abandoned grocery store where she usually fed the strays. He was badly injured. Fresh wounds covered his side. One ear was torn. And around his neck Mary noticed a deep burn mark hidden beneath his fur. Her eyes filled with tears instantly. "What did they do to you?" Shadow barely moved while she cleaned his wounds carefully inside her garage later that night. The dog trembled constantly. Every loud sound made him panic. At one point a car backfired outside. Shadow immediately tried hiding beneath the table. Mary's heart broke. No animal should live in that kind of fear. While cleaning him, Mary discovered something else. A tiny metal object hidden beneath his collar, a tracking chip. She stared at it in horror. They were tracking him. That meant whoever operated the facility probably knew exactly where he had been. Mary quickly destroyed the chip with a hammer. Then she locked every door inside her house. That night she barely slept. Around 2 a.m., Shadow suddenly began growling toward the front window. Mary looked outside carefully. A black SUV sat parked across the street, its headlights off. Someone was inside watching the house. Mary's blood ran cold. The SUV remained there for nearly an hour before finally driving away. The next morning, Mary drove straight to Walter Grayson. "This is bigger than we thought," she whispered. Walter studied Shadow carefully. "That dog escaped from somewhere terrible." Mary nodded. "And I think they want him back." remained silent for a long moment. Then he finally spoke. "We need proof." Over the next several days, Mary and Walter began investigating secretly. Walter searched old police records involving missing animals. Mary monitored the roads near the woods at night. What they discovered horrified them. Hundreds of dogs had disappeared over the last 8 years from nearby towns, strays, shelter dogs, pets from family homes. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Then Walter discovered something even stranger. Harbor Research Facility officially no longer existed. According to government records, it had closed 6 years earlier after financial restructuring. Yet clearly someone was still operating there. One evening, Mary sat reviewing videos she secretly recorded near the compound. Suddenly, she noticed something disturbing. One dog inside the cages kept staring directly at Shadow, not barking, watching him carefully. Same way frightened prisoners watch someone who escaped. Mary paused the footage, and then she understood. Shadow hadn't escaped and forgotten the others. He had been trying to go back, trying to save them. That was why he kept disappearing. That was why he always returned injured. The realization nearly shattered her. The dog had spent months searching for help because no human ever listened. Mary looked at Shadow lying beside the fireplace. "You were trying to tell us," she whispered. The dog lifted his head slowly. And for a moment Mary could swear he understood every word. Rain poured heavily the night they returned to the compound. Walter carried an old revolver beneath his jacket. Mary carried bolt cutters, a flashlight, and her phone. Shadow led them silently through the woods. No hesitation, no fear, almost like he remembered every inch of the place. When they reached the fence, Walter cut power to the generators behind the buildings. Floodlights died instantly. Darkness swallowed the compound. Then alarm sirens exploded. Walter cursed under his breath. Much for stealth. They climbed through the fence quickly. The smell inside the compound nearly made Mary sick immediately. Blood, chemicals, waste, fear. Dogs barked frantically somewhere nearby. Mary rushed toward the sound. Inside the first warehouse stood rows of metal cages, dozens of them. Some dogs were so thin their ribs showed clearly beneath their fur. Others had scars across their faces and bodies. One small husky pressed trembling paws against the bars desperately. Mary's eyes filled with tears. "It's okay," she whispered. "We're getting you out." Walter began recording everything: medical supplies, documents, injection equipment, training logs. Then Shadow suddenly barked furiously toward another room. Mary opened the heavy metal door carefully and froze. The second room was worse, far worse. Large military breeds filled reinforced cages: German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, Rottweilers, Dobermans. Many wore strange electronic collars. Some moved aggressively. Others looked completely broken. One dog paced endlessly in circles. Another stared blankly at the wall. Mary felt sick. "What did they do to you?" A calm voice answered behind her. "We improved them." Mary spun around instantly. A tall man wearing gloves and a dark raincoat stood in the doorway, cold eyes, no emotion, no humanity. Walter raised his revolver immediately. "Move." Man barely reacted. "You shouldn't have come here." Mary glared at him. "You torture animals." "They are assets," the man replied flatly. Shadow growled deeply beside her. The man looked directly at the dog. "K-93, he said calmly. "Our smartest subject." Mary stared in shock. "You named him like a machine. He was never meant to be a pet." The man stepped forward slightly. "You have no idea what we created here." Suddenly warehouse lights flickered back on. Men carrying rifles flooded into the building. Walter stepped backward slowly. "We're surrounded." The director smiled faintly. "You could have lived peacefully, Mrs. Carter." Mary's heart skipped. "You know who I am. We know everyone who gets close." Armed guards approached. Then chaos exploded. A terrified dog broke through one of the cages, then another, and another. Within seconds, barking filled the warehouse violently. Dogs charged in every direction. Some attacked guards. Some ran wildly toward exits. One armed man fell screaming as several shepherds knocked him to the ground. Shadow lunged directly at another guard holding a rifle. Walter grabbed Mary's arm. They sprinted through the warehouse while dogs flooded behind them. Gunshots erupted everywhere. Men shouted. Metal cages crashed loudly onto the floor. Mary reached the exit just as a bullet slammed into her shoulder. Pain exploded through her body. She collapsed hard into the mud outside. The world blurred instantly. Rain poured endlessly while barking echoed through the compound. Walter dragged her behind crates while firing toward the guards. "We have to leave." Mary shook violently. Blood soaked through her sweater rapidly. Then Shadow appeared beside her again, covered in mud, covered in blood, but alive. The dog nudged her hand gently, and suddenly Mary understood everything. Shadow had escaped months earlier. But instead of disappearing forever, he kept returning for the others. No human had rescued him, so he tried doing it himself over and over again, until finally he found Mary, a woman kind enough to listen. Mary forced herself upright painfully. "We finished this," she whispered. Using Walter's phone, she began live-streaming everything. The cages, the wounded dogs, the armed guards, the warehouse, the documents. "This place is real," Mary said breathlessly into the camera. "They've been kidnapping and experimenting on dogs for years." Gunfire interrupted her. Walter fired back. Police sirens echoed faintly in the distance now. Someone nearby must have reported the shooting. The director emerged from the rain looking furious. "You ruined everything." Mary pointed the phone directly at him. She whispered, "You did." Director raised his pistol. Before he could shoot, Shadow attacked. The dog slammed into him viciously, knocking the gun into the mud. Walter tackled the man immediately. Then police vehicles burst through the gates. Officers flooded the compound shouting commands. Guards surrendered. Some attempted escaping into the woods. Dogs scattered everywhere through the rain. Mary finally collapsed completely. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was Shadow standing beside her protectively. Like a guardian refusing to leave, Mary woke up in a hospital room 2 days later, her shoulder burned beneath thick bandages. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Walter sat nearby holding terrible hospital coffee. "You survived," he said with relief. Mary's first words were barely a whisper. "Dogs," Walter smiled tiredly. "Rescued." Filled Mary's eyes instantly. "How many?" 217. Mary covered her mouth. Walter leaned back slowly. Livestream spread everywhere before they shut it down. News stations picked it up nationwide. About the director, in federal custody. The facility, Walter's face darkened. What investigators found there was worse than anyone imagined. Mary listened silently. They discovered illegal behavioral experiments, neurological testing, aggression conditioning, and military contracts hidden through fake companies. Mary felt sick again. "The dogs, most will recover physically," Walter said quietly. "But some," he paused heavily. "Some were damaged badly." Mary closed her eyes painfully. "No creature deserved that suffering," Walter continued. "Animal rescue groups from all over the country came to help. Veterinarians too." Mary smiled weakly. "And Shadow," Walter hesitated. "He escaped from animal control twice." Mary laughed softly through tears. "That sounds like him." Later that evening, the hospital room door opened quietly. A nurse stepped aside nervously. Shadow walked inside. Mary burst into tears instantly. The dog approached slowly before resting his head gently beside her bed. For the first time since Daniel died, Mary no longer felt empty. Walter watched silently from the doorway. "You know," he said softly, "people always think humans rescue dogs." Mary stroked Shadow's scarred fur carefully. She whispered, "Dogs rescue humans too." 6 months later, the abandoned shelter outside town reopened under a new name, Mary's Haven. Donations poured in from across the country after the harbor facility story became national news. Volunteers rebuilt kennels. Veterinarians offered treatment. Families adopted rescued dogs. For the first time in years, many of those animals finally slept without fear. Every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, Mary still carried bowls of food across the shelter yard. Only now she wasn't alone anymore. Dogs surrounded her, wagging tails excitedly. Laughter replaced silence. Purpose replaced grief. Hope replaced loneliness. Walter visited, often helping repair fences and deliver supplies. "You know," he joked one evening, "retirement was supposed to be peaceful." Mary laughed softly. "You chose the wrong town for peace." News reporters still occasionally visited the shelter. They called Mary a hero, but Mary never liked that word, because in her mind, the real hero had 4 legs. Shadow remained different from the other dogs. He never stayed far from Mary, never fully relaxed around strangers. Sometimes he stared silently toward the woods for long periods, as if remembering something terrible. Some scars never disappeared completely. Not Mary's, not the dog's, not even Shadow's, but healing had finally begun. One cold evening Walter arrived carrying newspapers beneath his arm. "You made the front page again." Mary rolled her eyes playfully. Walter handed her the paper. The headline read, "Widow EXPOSES Secret Animal Experiment Facility." Beneath the headline sat a photograph of Mary beside Shadow outside the shelter. Walter looked toward the dog. "You think he understands what he did?" Mary watched Shadow carefully. The dog sat quietly beside the fence while sunset painted the sky orange behind him, older now, calmer now, but still watching everything carefully. Then Shadow slowly walked over and rested beside Mary's chair. Mary smiled softly. She whispered, "I think he always understood." Wind moved gently through the trees as darkness settled over the town. And somewhere deep inside that quiet darkness, for the very first time in years, no dogs cried for help anymore. Thank you for joining us. Make sure to drop your comment telling us where you're watching from. Don't forget to watch and subscribe. See you in the next one.